Okay, welcome everybody. Can you all see my screen and hear me just all right?
Yep.
Can you all hear me? Does this work?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, I see a thumbs up. Great. So let's get started. Today we'll be talking about tasks, design, and evaluation of visualization techniques. And so this is quite an important lecture, actually, because it's kind of like we're taking a step back from like just what is the pure, like how can I visualize something, thinking a little bit more about like, why do I do that? How can I get there? And how can I validate what I've done? And so it's kind of a shame that this is only a single lecture, but there's so much to cover. And at the end of the lecture, I'll point to some additional classes that teach you some of these concepts in more detail. And I want to start off with the topic of task analysis. And so when we think about task analysis, we really want to distinguish between problem-driven versus technique-driven approaches, especially in kind of like a research context. So for the grad students in here. So if you have like a problem-driven approach, this is kind of like a top-down approach where you go out and identify a problem that is encountered by users. And then you design a solution to help users work more effectively. And this is also sometimes called a design study, like an industry equivalent to a problem-driven research approach would be kind of like a project-driven, right? You work with a client that has a specific analysis or data visualization problem. You try to understand exactly what's going on, and then you develop a solution to that. In contrast to that, you have technique-driven approaches where this is like more bottom-up, where you try to invent new visualization techniques or algorithms that you think are kind of like smart or useful, or you identified a need through some kind of like means that are not necessarily just coming from one single user or customer. And then you classify this or compare it against other visualization techniques and algorithms. And from like a research perspective, this would be like your classical visualization technique paper. Like you have an idea of how to do like a better network layout. You develop that. From like a industry perspective, that would be like, I'm developing a product that is probably useful for many different people for many different applications. And so these are kind of like useful to think about, but even in like a technique-driven approach, even if you might not have like one unique customer, one unique problem, I think it's always important to kind of like think about users and use cases specifically. And so I mentioned last time that I would like you to read this paper for today as a nested model for visualization, design, and validation. And so usually in a classroom, I now ask somebody to summarize it, but I realized that this is a little bit kind of like not as pleasant to do on Zoom. So I'll spare you this, but just as an FYI, this is one of the papers that we will be kind of like considering as fair game to have specific questions about in the final for all of the grad students here. But I'll review this paper still a little bit in more detail. And so what is this nested model here? The purpose is to capture all of the different design decisions at the different stages of the design process, and then come up with the justifications, like rationalize the justifications of your design. And so this is a paper by Tamara Munson. She broke it apart into 4 different concerns and proposes aspects and validations methods for each of these concerns. And it also allows you to validate early and often and to identify if you get something wrong, where did you get it wrong? So overall, the goal is, of course, to avoid making ineffective solutions and make an effective solution. And so these are the 4 stages of the nested model. So you have the domain problem characterization. So this is kind of like understanding what your users want to do. Then your data operation abstraction design. This is kind of like a necessary step of translating from this domain problem to a language that we as visualization designers understand. Then we have the encoding interaction technique design step. This is really like mostly what this class has been about so far. Like when I teach you about like what are the different table of data visualizations out there, what are the different channels and so on. This is all about like designing encodings and interaction. And then finally, algorithm design. Algorithm design is about like, well, I want to do this kind of like a physics-based model for my network layout, but how do I actually do that? And then you come up with like this spring embedded algorithm with like specifically how do you do that? And then you have to think about, well, is this algorithm sufficient? Is this algorithm performant enough? Does this algorithm kind of like satisfy my design criteria and so on? In this extended chart here, like you see for each of these levels, what are some potential threats to getting it wrong in that particular level, and what are some kind of like validation methods. And so interestingly, for most cases, there is like a validation that you can do before you move on, and then there's a validation after you've completely completed the cycle. So on a domain problem characterization level, the threat is that you like are working on the wrong problem, and immediately you can validate this by observing and interviewing your target users and making sure that this is in fact the right problem to work on. Of course, like this only tells you so much. You don't like your target users is a small group, and so if you like after you've run the whole cycle, like here at the bottom, you can see that you also can validate that you worked on a relevant or on the right problem by observing adoption rates. But to be able to do that, you have to run through the whole process. On a data operation abstraction design level, you have kind of like the threat that you simply get it wrong, but that's really hard to validate before you move on. So there's no like pre-moving on validation step here, but we can then validate it after we've implemented a visualization technique by testing it on target users, collecting evidence of utility, or by running field studies and documenting usage of the deployed system. On the encoding interaction technique design level, it could be that we like pick the wrong encoding, an ineffective encoding, or an ineffective interaction technique. And so validation here is mostly through logic, that you justify why this is suitable, basically relying on carefully crafted arguments. But if you have already implemented it, here you can kind of like run qualitative or quantitative studies. So you can test it on users. You can do an informal usability study, or you can do like a formal lab study and you measure human time and error or satisfaction or anything like that. And then finally, in the middle, algorithm design is your threat could be like it's a slow algorithm that doesn't work for the scale of the data. So you could either like analyze computational complexity ahead of time and theoretically reason about whether your algorithm will work, or you could measure system time and memory after you've implemented your algorithm. So this maybe like we'll come back to this if this sounded a little bit abstract, but I think this is a very useful model. And if you ever design a visualization, I definitely encourage you to break it down and think about this in that way. But here's kind of like let's say a slightly simplified way of thinking about this design process. So first, you have to understand the domain problem, kind of like what is it that you're trying to do. Then you have to translate the domain problem to kind of like an abstract task analysis. So we'll do an exercise a little bit later about this, but if you talk to, let's say, a physicist or a biologist and they want you to help with like their domain problem, it's probably gonna end up in some kind of like, hey, I wanna like analyze correlation in this data set. And so then analyzing correlation is something that is an abstract task, and that we know something about, and then we can identify and implement a suitable technique based on that. And just the task analysis, of course, isn't enough. You have to also like look at the data that you have and some other factors that may play a role. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about this domain characterization. This is really all about the details of an application domain. What is this group of user? What is this target domain? what are their questions and their data. And as you can imagine, this is extremely diverse. This is like there's many, many different problems that don't seem to have anything in common out there in the domain. But one thing that is important here is that these problems need to be specific enough so that you can actually run a project, right? It can't be just like, oh, I want to understand something X, Y. It has to be a little bit more specific. Like we have this data set. We believe that based on this data set, we can reason about this and that, but we need a visualization to help us with that. And one thing, if you ever try to like do this domain characterization and talk to, let's say, a customer, a user, or a collaborator, you can't just ask people what they do or what they want. This is kind of like your job. You have to have a process in there. Introspection is hard. This is also very much along the infamous or famous quote about, like, Henry Ford said, like, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said they wanted faster horses and not cars, right? And this is kind of like a little bit along these lines here. You can't just ask people what they do and what they need. You have to get at this by doing something a little bit more sophisticated, by having like interviews, by observing them. And I'll talk about some other methods like workshops for requirement elicitation in a bit. So when we do this domain problem characterization, or as I already hinted at, we have like this infinite number of domain tasks, but you typically can break them down into simpler abstract tasks. And then we do know how to address these abstract tasks. And if we identify like a task and data sets or data combination, then we have kind of like, based on all of the stuff that we learned in this class so far, we can probably say, well, if I want to see correlation in a tabular data set, you might want to pick a scatter plot matrix or a parallel coordinates plot. But getting to that step from like, hey, I want to like analyze this interesting problem in my domain to, this is a problem about analyzing correlation between multiple dimensions. This is what domain problem characterization is. So a simple example would be to find good movies. So like, let's say I want to identify good movies in genres alike, and then I can think of this, like, who is my audience here? It's like general population or movie enthusiasts. And I'll use this as a running example as we go down these different levels. So the goal here is to identify good movies in the genres alike, and then next we'll have to think about what is it that this actually means. And so that's where data and task abstraction comes in, like the what and why, mapping into like generalized terms, like identifying tasks that users wish to perform or already do, and then I find data types and a good model of the data. And of course, as always in visualization, sometimes like the raw data or the data that you get from your collaborators isn't necessarily exactly what you need. So you might have to do some data transformations and data cleanup and so on. And so in the movie example, like, well, we now have to start thinking about what is a good movie. Does good movie mean highly rated by critics, highly rated by audiences, successful at the box office, similar to movies I liked, similar or specific genres that I like? Maybe it's a combination of all of those different things. So thinking about these like specific questions here is important. And then you also have to think about your data sources, right? You could kind of like try to scrape IMDb. You could scrape Rotten Tomatoes. There might be some data set like this out there already. And then as a next step, you go into encoding and interaction design. So this is really where the design of the visualization technique happens, where you like develop the visual encodings, enter interactions, and the ways to create and manipulate the visual representations of the data. And of course, decisions on these may be completely separate, or they may be intertwined. And here, like the whole like visualization design principles that we talked about in a design lecture or in the visualization alphabet lecture, these kinds of like this knowledge drives these decisions. So in the finding good movies example, I might have decided that like a combination of audience ratings and critics ratings is and then filtering by genres is a good approach for my particular problem. And I could kind of choose a stacked bar chart for these ratings, and like in the visualization technique, like I'm showing here on the right, and then have a filter interface for the genre, right? So that would be like one solution to that particular problem. Of course, in practice, if you work on with scientific collaborators, it can be a little bit more complicated. So here is kind of an example from a paper that I wrote with a couple of other people in 2016, where the goal was to control the data quality for gene splicing data. So very, like, let's say, domain-specific goal. And this was actually only one of the 4 goals. I'm kind of like showing you as a screenshot of the paper here. So goal 4 was control data quality. There were 3 other goals. But for this particular goal, control data quality, we kind of broke it down. Like, we broke down this into tasks. And so the tasks were then like judge the magnitude of an individual sample, compare those samples, and compare groups of samples. And so these 3 tasks, they kind of map, like, if I can do all of these with respect to this particular data set, then I can satisfy my goal. This is now I want to talk a little bit, because I've used the word tasks fairly informally, and we've used this in some other contexts already. But now I want to talk a little bit about this more formally. And so this is kind of based on this chapter in our textbook on chapter 3 on task abstraction. So generally, if we think about tasks, we have kind of like actions and targets. So what is it that we want to do, and what do we want to kind of like do it with or at? And so here I'm looking at these actions. So for the task, it would be things like very high-level things like analyze. I have some high-level choices here to make. Do I want to consume data? Also, like, do I want to consume data, or do I want to produce something, for example, using annotation? Or I could want to search. I want to find an unknown or a known item. Or I might want to query. I want to find out about characteristics of items by itself, or rather relative to others. And so if we dive into this a little bit, the consume, in the consume kind of high-level task, we kind of like have to choose essentially, or we like commonly we choose between discovery versus presentation. This is this classic split from exploration to explanation. And so presentation, of course, is different, and explanation is different. That somebody has kind of like made an explicit effort to show you something and tell you a story about it, whereas the exploration piece is really about discovery of something new in a data set. And then, of course, we can use visualizations also casually to enjoy it and to kind of like in a social context. With respect to the produce action, we want, like, very frequently, we want to annotate when we find something, right? Like, especially in this discovery process, we want to annotate something so that we kind of like maybe transition between this discovery and presentation process. And you might also want to record some kind of like analysis session so that you can then later do that. And then finally, derive is kind of like a more or less it's a design choice, but it can also be something that the user, not the visualization designer, makes, right? So you could, for example, like do some kind of data derivation in an interactive interface to say, hey, I want to kind of like map like the categories into, and like I want to group by these categories, for example. That would be a common data derivation. You kind of like create these new groups in here. On this mid-level, we have these kind of like search and query actions. So search is really about like I want to find something, but it depends. The approaches are really a little bit different based on what we already know about that item. So it could be that we are looking for something that we don't know anything about, or we have some kind of like, we have a vague idea, but we don't know exactly what we want to do, and we don't know exactly where it is. And that would be kind of like the bottom right bin on the graphic here on the right. That would be kind of the explore bin. So I'm kind of like looking at the different things. So you could think of this as, well, I might want to go eat at a restaurant, but I don't know, like I don't know exactly where I want to eat, and I don't know exactly where, like physically, or which restaurant this has to be, or which kind of food. So this would be exploration. If I know the location, for example, I say, hey, I want to really, like, this has to be within my neighborhood, but I don't know exactly which restaurant, then I would be kind of like in the browse space. If I know exactly which restaurant I want to be, so like I want to eat Indian food in my neighborhood, then really this is just a lookup procedure. And so I might just get some extra information about this restaurant. For example, what are the opening hours, of what is the menu? If I roughly know what I want to do but not where, then that would be a locate step. So I want to eat Indian food, but I don't know where there's an Indian restaurant. Then you have like your locate task here. And then similarly to the search, on the same level, we can also we have these kind of like query tasks. And for querying, we kind of like either like we think a lot about how much of the data really matters. Do we want to kind of like identify individual elements in our data set, or do we want to compare two different data sets, or do we want to get an overview of everything that's going on? So here is an example of comparing and also deriving. And so this is a graph of kind of like how did the GDP of various states develop during economic crisis. And so we want to compare these different economic crises across different countries. And by doing so, like one smart design decision that this person that created this chart here has made was, like, we're not trying to align this by like year, like by actual the year, or by the year it by like a global time scale, but we want to align it by the start of a crisis, right? And in this way, we can compare things like the Great Depression in starting in 29 in the United States to kind of like the financial crisis we had in 2008. And now we can like overlay different countries and show how they compare, how they perform relative to each other. And so we see here that generally the Euro area and Britain in the 2008 financial crisis had like a slump but recovered, whereas Greece really had a very dramatic recession that is much more like what the United States experienced in 1929 than what other countries experienced in 2008. And so on the right, you see kind of like if you were to derive this data set now, instead of like showing the change, by showing this change very explicitly here for Greece, you kind of see this massive drop. Like basically, this is now taking the delta, the steepness of the curve, and mapping it as a bar chart so that you can see, well, it actually was like really bad, especially between 2008 and 2009 in that quarter. On the lower level, you might want to like look at targets. So if you look at all data, you might want to identify trends or outliers or specific features. And features is here very generic, right? That can be whatever, like a specific shape in a line chart or a cluster or anything like that. And for network data, you have targets such as like identifying topology or identifying path. So topological structures or specific path. And for attributes, you kind of distinguish between like one and many. And so like you might want to look at the distribution for one, or like at extremes. And if you have many, you want to look at dependencies between multiple items, correlations between items, or similarities between items. So here is an example that is about staying with the recession theme, how did the job market develop since the recession overall? And what we want to look here is kind of like all of these different things. We want to look at trends, we want to look at outliers and at features. And so I'm going to open up that page. So this is this piece here, and what we see here is individual professions like nail salons here. So we see that we have like a double encoding. We have color if a profession, essentially employment in a particular profession went up, and we have also like the spatial encoding, and then we have like red for declining jobs. And of course, we know already that red-green is kind of like a problematic color choice. But let's ignore that for now. And so if we scroll this up, then we break this breaks up a little bit, and also notice the layered storytelling here, right, where we have this stepper interface. But this interface allows us to kind of like quickly identify outliers and trends. And so we can see that roughly, well, internet publishing, support for oil and gas operations, oil and gas extractions, computer systems and programming software, this kind of stuff did well, whereas land subdivision, like real estate related things, seem to have been doing pretty badly, and like some like bookstores and dealers and so on, these might not be necessarily completely related to housing. So here we kind of like want to look at both trends and outliers in this example. So now I want to do like an exercise for this task abstraction. And so the goal here will be that I'll give you 10 minutes in breakout rooms, and this is also an activity that you can submit. This is kind of like a simulated scenario. I want you to think about, and I'm going to read this to you. You've been approached by a geneticist to help with a visualization problem. She has gene expression data, which is data that measures the activity of genes for 30 cancer tissue samples. She's applying an experimental drug to see whether the cancer tissue dies as she hopes, but she finds that only some samples show the desired effect. She believes that the differences between the samples is caused by differential expression, differential activity of genes in a particular pathway, for example, an interaction network of genes. And she would like to understand which genes are likely to cause the difference and what role they play in that pathway. And so I want you to do first like a task abstraction. Think about like what this is this high level goal from the biology domain. But what does this mean in the space of kind of like data sets and tasks that we just talked about? What are the more generic tasks that we need to identify to answer that question? And then I also want you to spend a little bit, once you've done this task abstraction, then you should kind of like identify based on these tasks, which of the visualization techniques that we've learned about in the past would be appropriate for that problem. And so this isn't completely easy, so we'll do 10 minutes. It's now 12:54, and I'll open up the breakout rooms, and we'll return here at 1:05. Any questions before I start the breakout rooms? Okay, here we go. Okay, so what did people think? Was that hard, easy? What were your solutions roughly?
I'd call it quite difficult.
Yeah, we did our best. We didn't totally understand.
Definitely the hardest breakout we've done.
I think that mostly had to do with just not understanding what these different components are.
Any kind of like
what
what are the kind of
what
like
is a pathway? What is
wanna
the interaction?
roughly sketch what they thought about? What would be and what would be a good visualization solution here?
We went with some sort of side-by-side where you can do like a drill down in both of them to compare different parts, gene expressions and things like that.
I'd say a network.
Okay, I get it. This isn't easy, so I'll give you an example of how, like, what could be an approach to do this. So if we read this closely, we will see that only some samples show the desired effect. So what we see here is that we actually seem to have two groups of samples. So there is those that react and those that don't. And then we have the sentence: the difference between the samples is caused by differential expression of genes in a particular pathway. She would like to understand which genes are likely to cause the difference. So what we can kind of like take from this is what we want to do here is identify those genes and then compare the gene expression of pathway genes between the two groups. And then finally, we want to identify the outliers here. So like that's kind of roughly how you could break down the tasks for this particular domain goal. And so then she would also like to understand which genes are likely to cause the difference and what role they play in that pathway. And so that would now be to locate the outlier that we have previously identified now in the network and then explore the topology. And so I realized that this is a little bit, let's say, like not necessarily something that you come up with in 5 or 10 minutes, but I hope it kind of engaged you a little bit and made you think about these task abstractions. So now, like, how could we, based on this information on these tasks, we can now think a little bit about the encoding design. So we have tabular data with 30 samples and about 30 genes. We want to compare groups. We want to spot outliers. So like if we look through this, these are kind of like the major tabular data visualization techniques we could use for that. Well, dimensionality reduction and then plotting this as a scatter plot. It doesn't show us the raw data. It's also not so great to compare groups. So that might not be the appropriate choice here. For scatter plot matrices, 30 samples is a little bit too much. It's a scalability problem. For parallel coordinates, we also have a bit of a scalability problem. Coloring would be necessary to be able to do comparisons. If we think about heat maps or bar charts, those actually work, right? We can have kind of like spatial separation of groups and like have one group versus another group. And similarly for bar charts, they work even better here. They use kind of like they have the encoding advantage, and it's still at the scale where we can do 30 by 30. So we can say, okay, well, for this kind of data, a heat map or like a tabular bar chart seems to be kind of an appropriate encoding. And this is like, I didn't come up with this particular domain goal. This is something that I actually worked on. And this was kind of the design that we eventually ended up, like this tabular layout with these group bar charts where you could see, like, where you could kind of like compare between the different groups and where you could spot outliers and where you can kind of like look at all of these samples in the rows. And then the second piece about this whole design was that network aspect, right? So here we're going into multivariate networks. We have like a network with 30 genes. We want to explore the topology and look up nodes. And so if you think about what are the kind of like visualization techniques we have for that, well, we have matrices, but matrices don't really work for topology-based tasks, so we can't use them. We have tree maps. Tree maps don't really work for general networks like we have here. so we can kind of like dismiss tree maps. And so we have to use basically a node link diagram. So we can now combine a node link diagram with a table by using a multiple view concept and by linking them through shared highlighting. And so this is roughly what we did here. So you could select some of these items and then see these items in the table. So does this make sense? Once you see the slides, you can kind of go through this again and kind of reproduce this design process a little bit more. And I hope that it's helpful. Any thoughts and comments before we move on?
I think it was definitely a challenge to get the picture of a gene diagram in your head without knowing really anything about it. And then I think I would also recommend really sitting down with the person beforehand.
Great. So now I want to talk a little bit more about the design process itself. So first, we want to ask the question, what is design? And design is really about creating something new to solve a problem. And design is a process that can be used to do this in any kind of context, including making buildings, bridges, chairs, user interfaces, websites, anything like that. This is all of a design process. And design is, of course, used in many, many different fields. And it has many, many possible users or tasks. And so I don't want to play this video, but I want to add the link here and just give it a shout out. This is a video about the design of a soda can and what goes into the design of the soda can and why it is designed this way. What are the kind of different properties that people try to kind of compromise and how this design has evolved over, let's say, the 100 years that we've used soda cans. So definitely take a look at this if you want to see an engineering example of what design can lead to. It's also useful to kind of say very explicitly, design isn't about graphic design. Graphic design is something that we do, but it's not about design, at least not in the sense that I'm talking about it here. So it's not just about making things pretty. It's not about art. It's not about appreciation of beauty or emotions. It's also not something without a clear purpose, right? Like when we design something, we have a clear purpose. It's also not building without justification or evidence. So in contrast, design is about making justified choices and trying to collect evidence that these choices are good. And you've heard about form follows functions before, I'm sure. And this is important to think about because function can constrain all the possible forms. If I had no specific function, I can't really constrain what forms it can take. So the form depends on tasks that must be achieved. And the better defined the goals of an artifact, the narrower the variety of forms it can adopt. So for example, if you look at the table up here on the right, if you say, well, what I want is a table where I can sit and eat my meal, that is a specification that is okay. But if an additional specification would be that I also want the table to be useful to socialize with other people while I'm eating, then I could argue that this function here, this form here doesn't allow that particular function. So the more specific I am about my goals, the clearer it is what I want to have, what I want to create. And so that kind of gets into this requirements design and the task abstraction piece in here. And you might have heard the term wicked problems. This is it sounds informal, but it's actually a term that is formally used for design. So wicked problems are those where you don't have a clear problem definitions and where there's many different solutions, but they are either good enough or not good enough, but there isn't a single unique solution. So you can have multiple good solutions that solve the problem after a design process. They might solve it with different kind of efficiency or with different pros and cons, but there is multiple solutions. And there's also not a clear point to when are you done, right? When have you kind of successfully designed something? This is very different from like other like tame or non-wicked problems. So for example, if you have a mathematical proof, you know when to stop, right? You have proven it. Or a puzzle, you have a definite solution. Or a chess game, like you won or not. I want to like, again, not play this video, but this is kind of like an example of somebody has designed this bridge and then some wind came in and that bridge broke down. So I recommend that you take a look at this video, play it, because again, it's a very striking thing, because here clearly the solution was not good enough of that design problem, because not all of the constraints, in this case wind, were properly considered. So why does design matter for Viz? Well, it's really all about is like visualization is about designing visualization. So there's many very ineffective visualization combinations, and we have plenty of users with unique problems and data, and we have these variations of tasks, and we have a very, very large design space. So one thing that commonly happens is that people tend to think about, hey, I built this really cool visualization technique last year, and then if you have a new problem, you might be kind of like, you have this hammer in search of a nail, and you might want to try to fit like your solution to a potential problem, right? And so you can think of this as like here, this big rectangle here would be the design space, and the glyphs in there would be all of the different possible solutions. And so some of those solutions might be good, some of them might be okay, some of them might be poor. And so now, like, one thing is like, here's my technique, and that might be an okay solution for a particular problem, but clearly not the best solution. And so the design space is, of course, like you can only pick among the techniques in a design space that you know about. So like if there is an excellent solution and you've never heard about it, or you don't know about it, then you cannot like essentially use that solution to address the problem. So like first you have to know many different solutions, and then that kind of constrains like what you can select. Then you consider them, you kind of like subset them for a particular reason. Then you propose two solutions that you think might be good. You kind of like weigh off their pros and cons, and then eventually you select one technique. And as you can see here, like the more you know about something, and the more diligent and the more good solutions there are, the more likely you will end up with a good design solution. So the kind of lesson here is to think broadly about a problem and not be too narrow about like, this is the stuff that I've used before. This might also apply to what you've just done. And so there is, of course, design is this complicated process, but a lot of people have thought about how can we create efficient design solutions to these kinds of wicked problems. And like we've in our lab, this is work by mostly Ethan Kertzner and Mariah Meyer with collaborators from all over the world. They have thought about like, how can we efficiently get to this domain characterization and understand the domain goals? Like, how can we get these requirements, these design requirements from a group of experts? Usually, like the way you do this is by doing multiple interviews, or by doing like a week-long or 2-week-long or multiple weeks-long observation with a group of users. But this is kind of like ineffective. And as I already mentioned earlier, just asking people what they would like is often not so great. And so they came up with this methodology where you have different activities that are like ideation activities. You might have been part of such an ideation workshop where like things like brainstorming or and so on happen. And here's a couple of more specific activities. So for example, they proposed like a wishful thinking activity. Like, what if I had no what would be things that I would really wish I could be doing with my data or my visualizations? Then they have an activity saying that is about constraint removal. So what are the things that are stopping you from achieving your goal here? now imagine this weren't here. What would be different? And then there would be like other things like analogical reasoning or storyboarding. I don't want to go too much into the detail, but they have an excellent website here where you can see like information about this workshop and a description of all of these different methods that you can kind of like that are described here, like how do mind maps work, how do group mixing work, and so on. And then you can kind of like build such a workshop. And they also have some example workshops here where that you can use to create such a session, and then bring together like a group of users, a group of like analysts that you work with if you design something, and then get to like a successful like set of requirements. And we use this all the time. So here is a kind of like a picture from one of these creativity workshops that you did with bioinformaticists at Arab laboratories. Yeah, we were designing a visualization technique together with them, and this was kind of the first step, like really understanding exactly what was going on. And we used all of these ideation and grouping and constraint removal techniques, and so on. Later in the design phase, once you have kind of your requirements and you start to develop prototypes, there's lots of evidence that when you develop prototypes or designs, you should try to develop designs in parallel, and kind of like think about them not in iterations, but really like maybe start to 2 or 3 things that are completely different. That's also why whenever we do a redesign exercise, I ask you to do 2 alternative sketches, for example, because serial design tends to constrain us. Like if you, in this example of like a graphic design problem, you can see that like, well, they started out with a serial design here, and it didn't really change all that much, and maybe it's not a great initial design, right? But if you had in parallel designs, you can see that like if you start with 3 completely different ideas, you might eventually incorporate the best of all of these ideas and create some nice kind of like solution by doing that. One methodology that can kind of like lead you through this whole process is this 5 designed sheet methodology. So this is kind of like tailored to visualization design, both for industry and classroom use. And it kind of like if you haven't done this before, it can be a useful way to structure this. So you could have like a brainstorm, like you have a brainstorming sheet, then you have some kind of like these different design sheets, and then you have like a 5th sheet that kind of like converges on one particular design. And so you can learn more about this methodology at the fds.design website. And then another methodology that you can use, especially if you are not super familiar with visualization or want to work with somebody who's not familiar with visualization, are these visit cards, because it kind of like has all of these different components. It has kind of like domain problems. It has kind of like inspiration cards, abstraction cards, layouts cards, and so on, that you can use in different contexts, including in the classroom. And so this is something that is like fun to play with if you're like have a physical class. In terms of prototyping, I do always encourage people to do like hand sketches, especially in the beginning of a process, because that is kind of easy to develop alternative designs. But of course, there is now really like many great wireframing tools out there. Like for example, dedicated tools like Adobe XD or Sketch can be used also for visualization design. But it's also like if you don't know these or don't have these tools, you can also use PowerPoint or Keynote or Adobe Illustrator or any other kind of like vector graphic or other graphic program. And one way to sketch and explore things with data would be Tableau, because Tableau is kind of like you can create visualization designs fairly fast. And they might not be like exactly what you need, but you can essentially prototype with data using Tableau. And now I want to give you a couple of examples of how designs iterate or how designs develop into different tools. So here is like some like an example of a technique that I developed a couple of years ago. Like we started out on the whiteboard, and you can see that the initial idea was pretty much there already, and there were some alternatives that we considered. But it really, like between the first sketch and the second sketch and the third sketch, there really isn't all that much divergence. But you can see that these sketches kind of like help you think through the problem. And then this is like a more recent one where we like did an evolutionary biology design study. We started out with hand sketches and then did some much more detailed design, detailed designs in Illustrator, and then eventually implemented something that looks fairly similar to the detailed design, but not completely. There's of course always, when you start working with real data in the real context, you always forgot about something. Or here's something where we might have kind of like started out with like fairly different ideas from what we ended up with. So we had sketches. These are all hand sketches on an iPad on the left. And then we had a prototype, but we used sketching here for like design reviews. And then eventually had like a final implementation that you can see here on the right. One other method that is frequently used in HCI or in kind of like usability evaluation in industry are these interactive prototypes. And so interactive prototypes are super lo-fi methods where you create kind of like mock-ups that simulate some kind of feature set and that show how, let's say, if you click this button, what happens next, and so on. And you can do these kind of prototypes, these interactive prototypes, with wireframing tools nowadays. You can get really sophisticated tools that allow you to kind of like almost simulate an application very close to what it is. But there's also something to be said for like good old paper-based simulations. And so that would really be, it's like, hey, I have my menu here, and now I can click on this button, and then an experimenter shows you a next sheet, right? This was what this would look like. And so people have like evaluated what does this, what's going on here? Like, why would you use paper prototypes if you could use like wireframes fairly easily? And they in this paper, they found that using this paper prototypes is kind of leads to more creativity and interaction, and people tend to think of it as less final, and they are more open to suggest alternatives or to raise issues than they are if they see some polished wireframe prototype. Of course, there's plenty of other methods out there. Like you can do like interviews or observations. You can do qualitative analysis. You can develop usage personas. You can do data sketches, or you can do coding-based prototypes. But this was just like a couple of teaser like methods that you could use along different points in the design process. Any questions about the design process? Okay, so now the last topic I want to cover today, and we might not completely wrap it up, but let's get started anyways, is evaluation. And evaluation is kind of like after the fact, seeing whether something is a good solution. And I do recommend, if you want to learn about evaluation for visualization, this particular paper here. It's kind of like a survey of all the different kinds of approaches, the pros and cons. It's by Sheila Carpendale. It's a little bit older, from 2008, but it's still just as valid. And she discusses all of the relevant kind of like dimensions, methodologies, and caveats that you have to think about when you evaluate visualizations. So what is kind of like the role of evaluation or validation? We want to kind of avoid ineffective solutions, justify solutions, and also kind of like argue about which is a better solution or what is a good solution for a problem. There's multiple dimensions that you could evaluate on. So for example, evaluation could be used for kind of like almost do perceptual science, like where you kind of like do something like we had in this crowd-sourced experiments where we want to study which is a bar more effective than a bubble, or is kind of like what is the just noticeable difference of colors, and or can you any kinds of these low-level perceptual features where you can design a very clear thing that is almost a psychology study, right? On the other extreme, you have the question, is my visualization system any good? That's, of course, also a valid question, but it is very different from having a quantifiable answer between kind of better judge size in a rectangle or in a bubble, right? These are very different questions. Then I have this dimension of, is something unique, or do I have to make a comparison? So, for example, if I design a system for, like, say, my research collaborators that helps them to study cancer data, can I easily compare that to another system? It might not make sense, right? It might be just so unique that I can't really do a comparison. So I might have to take a different route about validating this particular tool. And then there's also separately of like doing this comparative evaluation or quantitative evaluation, there's usability testing, like checking for problems with the system. You're not really questioning essentially your fundamentals, but you're seeing whether what you did here, there's like any problems that you can spot and any bugs that you can fix. So here is, like I showed this before, but this is an example of a comparative study where we looked at perception and task, right? We evaluated these 3 different techniques: straight visual links, just highlighting with frames, and context preserving links. Were they were people just as fast, just as correct, and what were their preferences? And we kind of like were able to answer, develop hypothesis, and then kind of like design an experiment where we could kind of like test that hypothesis and then do some conclusion. Yes, our hypothesis was true or was false. That's fine, and that's like a very important way of doing these kinds of studies. So that's kind of like one extreme. Another more kind of like let's say softer question we had is like, what do people look at and how do they actually work on these charts? And so here we used eye tracking to kind of like get a little bit of a sense of what people looked at. And when we overlaid these eye tracking paths, we saw pretty clearly that compared like the visual links conditions compared to the original, like to the highlighting, that people were much more focused, right? You could see that there was much more scanning around on the screen compared to down there, where you had these very salient links and you just had to visit all of the extremes of these links, whereas in the other case, you had to do more of like a serial search. So that's kind of like an interesting, let's say, less quantitative insight that we had based on a study like this. On the other extreme, where we don't have like a comparison, this is a tool that we built to kind of study genealogical data and clinical data. In this case, we studied suicide in large Utah families, and here, like, you can't really do an evaluation comparing 2 systems and measure how much faster or how much more precise did somebody answer a task, right? Because it is about like a researcher learning something about their data, and it doesn't really matter whether this was 2 seconds faster or not. And so what you do in a case like this is you write up a case study. You demonstrate the usefulness for the scientists, and you make a case that they couldn't have done this analysis without your visualization, and that your visualization was instrumental in kind of some important discovery. And just for like, this would be an alternative visualization technique for the same problem. Just like running a comparison between those 2 visualization techniques wouldn't make a ton of sense because they can't show the same data, right? And they clearly have very different kind of design parameters. So, and even if you knew later that, well, they did a task this and that much faster, that might not be all that relevant, right? Like what you really want to do is these higher level insights. And so making these comparisons for these very complicated systems probably doesn't make a ton of sense. So, like, if we think about this a little bit more structured, we have kind of like this spectrum for certainty over what causes difference between, let's say, two conditions. This can be like, if you want to have this certainty, you very frequently have to get it into like not so realistic settings. That means you reduce your ecological validity. If you want to have high ecological validity, like have systems as they're actually used, have real users use them, then you usually have something that is so complex and so many other factors happening that it's not completely clear what causes the differences. And so this is like a very common trade-off that you have to kind of like navigate when you evaluate visualization systems or like any kinds of software artifacts. So you can do like a controlled experiment in a lab or in a crowdsourced study, which is on this like spectrum, like not very realistic, but it has high like ecological validity because you can design like your factors very carefully. Then you can do interviews or questionnaires, which are like unstructured, structured, or semi-structured, which is somewhere in the middle. Then you can do field observations, like you've actually deployed something, and then you see how are people using it. For example, you can do video or audio analysis, or you can kind of code or classify user behavior. You can do things like think aloud tests. And that is, of course, like much closer to an actual to an actual scenario, and so you get higher ecological validity. But it might be like you have a much more complicated system. You might not have isolated factors. You might not be able to do comparisons even here, and so it kind of like reduces this certainty over what causes the differences. I can say that my solution is satisfactory, but I can't say it's better than something else, and that's especially true for case studies. There's also kind of like other things that you can do. For example, like one important thing is, of course, to do algorithmic performance measurement. If one of your claims is that my algorithm is faster, then you want to just like, you don't need necessarily a user like study or something like that. You can just measure performance. Another approach that is fairly common is heuristic evaluations, where you kind of like have an expert and maybe an outside expert judge compliance with some kind of recognized metrics or usability methods. And I already mentioned think aloud tests, but for usability testing, you could also use the think aloud tests. And think aloud tests work like you give somebody a system and then you ask them to kind of like externalize their thoughts. Like, for example, say, and now I'm wondering where is, like, if I add this to a shopping cart, what will happen? I can see now that this has been added to my shopping cart. Now let me look at my shopping cart, whether the right number of items are actually in my shopping cart, and so on. That would be kind of like how I think a lot test works. An interesting experiment are these Wizard of Oz experiments. The idea here is that sometimes it makes sense to study whether something is effective before you actually build it, especially if you want to study something that is fairly complex. So here you would create a system, a fake system, where you say drag in a data, let me give you one example. You say, hey, I want to build a visualization recommendation system, and you let users pick their own data sets, right? This is very hard to do generically, but if we wanted to test how efficient such a system were, what we could do is we could test a user that says, hey, this is my data set, and now I'll drag it somewhere. And behind the scenes, you have an experimenter, like a human being, look at this data and make a smart decision very quickly, and then present the solution. So you kind of like completely fake the system by having a human invented on the fly. And that allows you to test functionality before it's implemented. So these are often very smart designs to test hypothetical systems that we could eventually build. I mentioned eye tracking, which is kind of like an increasingly important method for evaluation. Or you could have expert evaluations, expert walkthroughs. There's also insight-based evaluation, which is kind of a methodology where you can like track, track what did people learn and classify different types of insights. And then finally, you can like instrument your system to log, and then you can study what did people do, how did they do it, and this is especially useful in like real deployed use cases. And so when you run the study, you typically collect some metrics that you want later use to validate any claims that you make. So you have kind of like objective or numerical metric, things like task completion time, errors in number or percent of tasks completed, ratio of success to failures, number of repetitions, number of commands used, number of failed commands. You could capture physiological data such as heart rate or brain activity or kind of skin conductivity, and so on. You could collect a number of insights. Whereas on the other side, you have subjective metrics such as like ratings, rankings, user satisfaction, subjective performance, ease of use, intuitiveness, judgments, or comments and feedback that you get from participants. And so this kind of like already leads us a little bit into this quantitative versus qualitative evaluation spectrum here. Quantitative methods are all about objective metrics and measurements and using numbers and statistics for interpreting data. And qualitative methods are all about these subjective metrics. Do you want to describe situations, events, people, interactions, behaviors? Frequently, if you report on qualitative methods, you quote what people said about their experience. You discuss their attitudes, their beliefs, and their thoughts. And so this is really about understanding how people make reason about any experience they have in their environment or their world. And so those are useful for very different contexts, right? Like depending on what you're studying, you might want to use one or the other, or you want to use a mixed approach where you have both quantitative or qualitative methods. One other important concept here is internal versus external validity. Like internal validity is about where you can trust your experiment. This is kind of like high when you test it under controlled lab conditions, and you can make sure that the observed effects are due to the test conditions and not some random variable. And external validity is kind of like related to ecological validity. Is your experiment representative of real world usage? This is high when an interface is tested in the field. So for example, if you have some kind of like museum application on a handheld device, if you test it with real museum visitors in that real museum, then you can reason about, well, this is actually representative of that use case. And of course, we have, again, this trade-off between the closer I am to real-world situations, the more the experiment is susceptible to uncontrolled sources of variation. So for example, in the museum setting, there's like many things that can influence it, right? Like how like my application might really, like how my ratings might depend on how well the rest of the show is designed, and so on. And so if we talk about like the scope of these evaluations, we have kind of like these different levels, again, coming back to Tamara Manzner's paper here. We have like pre-design, design, prototype, deployment, and redesign phases. And we can kind of like apply evaluation here at each of these levels. And I don't want to read these examples to you, but I think by now you probably have gotten the point. And then kind of like one contrarian opinion to this whole business of doing kind of validation and formal validation is this kind of like engineering perspective. And I'm quoting here Jörg van Wijk, who is like a very well-established professor from the Netherlands, a visualization professor. And he's arguing that, well, I don't really care so much whether you show me that your technique is 2 seconds better than the other, but instead I want you to develop new methods or interfaces or software that are so awesome, cool, impressive, compelling, fascinating, exciting that reviewers, colleagues, users are totally convinced just by looking at your work and at some examples. So this is to say that like not always do you have to like formally prove that what you did is useful if you kind of like can show that given these examples, this is just like a completely new way of doing something. And as I mentioned, this was like a fairly rapid sketch of many different things. And there's dedicated classes that cover this kind of stuff. There's like an HCI class, which is usually taught in the graduate HCI class, which is usually taught in the fall. Wasn't this year because of COVID. Then there's an advanced HCI class. Similarly, I think it might not be offered because of like COVID and like having to focus our teaching on the core classes. There's like education psychology classes that do that cover this kind of stuff. There's design classes about product design and development. There's ethnographic methods classes in other departments, introduction to research design, and so on. And so if this kind of stuff is interesting to you, you should definitely like look also at the human-centered computing degree. Okay, that wraps it up for today. I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
I've got a question. Could you explain what you exactly mean by topology?